Okay, everyone, I believe we are live streaming. Hello, welcome to the November edition of the Radical Philosophy Hour. I'm Jake Bartholomew, co-host Chris Davidson. If you could say hello, Chris. Yeah, hello.
Hello,
Okay,
yeah.
and today I'm pleased to welcome Cynthia Kaufman and Dr. Reed Kurtz. We'll be presenting in that order as usual. First paper, 20 minutes, second paper, 20 minutes, and questions at the end. We invite everyone watching on YouTube to please send us your questions, whether as they come to you or at the very end. So I will begin with Dr. Kaufman. Cynthia Kaufman is the director of the Vasconcelos Institute for Democracy in Action, De Anza College, where she runs and teaches in a community organizing program. She is the author of 5 books on social change: Community Consumerism, Sustainability, and Happiness, How to Build a World Where Everyone Has Enough, The Sea is Rising and So Are We, A Climate Justice Handbook, Challenging Power, Democracy and Accountability in a Fractured World, Getting Past Capitalism, History, Vision, and Hope, and Ideas for Action, Relevant Theory for Radical Change. She has been active in a wide variety of social justice movements, including Central American Solidarity, union organizing, police accountability, and most recently, tenants' rights, transit justice, and climate change. She published on social justice and common defense and received her PhD and MA in philosophy from University of Massachusetts Amherst and her BA in development studies from UC Berkeley. She started college at Miracosta College, community college in Oceanside, California, and she is presenting Anti-Capitalism and the Climate Crisis. Please, Dr. Kaufman, thank you.
All right, thanks, Jake. So I just wanted to start by saying a couple quick things, which is that thank you for going through my whole little resume there. And I have a web page that has all of my writings. I'm always happy to give people free PDFs of my books. And also, I'm the editor of a book series with Routledge called Bridges to Another World. That's basically looking for serious but accessible work that talks about a transition to a livable world. So I'd love it. Just doing a little promo there for I would love to get some more manuscripts for that. And the call for that is in the on my webpage that I just put the link to. The other thing I wanted to say is that the talk that I'm going to give today is a kind of a shorter version of a book review that I wrote that's also on the webpage called Anti-Capitalism and the Climate Crisis. And yeah, anyhow, so we are at a time where the powerful insights of anti-capitalist thinking are crucial for dealing with the climate crisis and also the current global crisis in democracy, manifested most painfully for most of us here in the recent horrific election in the U.S. Since this talk was advertising about the climate crisis, and since that's where most of my own organizing at this moment is focused, I have kept that focus in this talk. But I also think that the main goal of my presentation is to argue for a rejuvenated approach to anti-capitalist analysis. And I think that that's both necessary for our organizing around the climate crisis and around building and protecting democracy. So I just wanted to say that that's sort of like substitute democracy almost everywhere in this paper where I say climate. Um, so much anti-capitalist thinking takes place within outdated and rigid frameworks that keep them from offering their full potential to help us forge organizing pathways. This talk will explore some of the ways that an anti-capitalist analysis can be helpful for climate activists and some of the places where the sort of outdatedness of some of our frameworks keeps anti-capitalist thinkers from contributing as much as they could to those doing organizing around the climate crisis and the crisis in democracy. So the scientific understanding of the climate crisis is really clear. The science continues to play an important role in helping us understand the ways that a multitude of the Earth's systems are being undermined. In the book, No Miracles Needed, the engineer Mark Jacobson has argued that all of the technological tools we need to get to a sustainable world that works for everybody are already with us and ready to go at prices that can be afforded. Many techno optimists and pro capitalist thinkers, such as Bill Gates and Michael Bloomberg, continue to believe that new technologies and efficient markets will solve the problems that we face. And yet, we all know that the move to a sustainable world is being seriously slowed down by entrenched political forces, and most especially the political power of the fossil fuel industry, and I would say the Republican Party in this country that does its bidding, et cetera. The solutions we have that we need to keep our Earth habitable for ourselves and many other species are not being rolled out at the pace required. And what's required and what's getting in the way are the entrenched forces of an economic system driven by profit and a political system dominated by those invested in keeping those profit driven forces in place. We need a clear analysis of what we're up against in terms of these forces, and we need political strategies for addressing them with the urgency needed to deeply change the trajectory of human society in the next few years. We need to understand the political and economic forces we're up against, and we need to have ideas that help us speed up effective organizing. The rich tradition of anti-capitalist analysis, and specifically Marxist analysis, helps us understand many aspects of this situation. And I'm just going to breeze through a couple of those. That leftist Marxist anti-capitalist analysis explains very well the ways that an economy driven by the pursuit of profit and political systems captured by those profit-driven forces slow action. Marx's work on how capitalism functions by creating insatiable needs with us and then runs our social systems based on feeding those insatiable needs remains one of the best analyses of how consumerism works. Marxist analysis does a great job explaining how it is that states come to be captured and dominated by industries. Another point, one of the forces we're up against in the is a pro-capitalist set of beliefs propagated since capitalism's inception 500 years ago, but intensified since the 1980s, is in the discourse of neoliberalism. That set of beliefs argues that markets will solve our problems, that regulation is bad for the economy, that we are all best off when government does little more than provide a framework in which business can operate. It's a world historic tragedy that the climate crisis was dropped on our doorstep at the time when neoliberal ideology was ascendant. Addressing the climate crisis requires strong governmental regulation, and it can be understood in mainstream economic terms as a massive market failure. Another couple of points. Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci's analysis of how hegemonic blocks function is crucial for understanding how it is that pensions funds and banks continue to support the fossil fuel industry, even as that industry is responsible for devastating our world. Challenging that dominant hegemony requires that we create counter narratives, that create new ways of understanding the world that we're in, and new ways of understanding what the economy is and what it's for. The great Marxist historian Karl Polanyi explained for us the ways that the idea that there is a separate part of life called the economy that should be left alone and that it has its own needs is a myth that keeps us from building economic structures that meet human and ecological needs. Part of dealing with the climate crisis is challenging the deeply entrenched ideas that markets should be left alone to work their magic and that we should base policies on what, quote, the economy needs, rather than what is required for our actual survival. Having started with those important insights from the anti-capitalist canon, which are helpful for organizing in both the climate and pro-democracy spaces, I now want to discuss two significant areas from our canon that cloud our understanding of anti-capitalism and make it less than helpful in climate and I would say also pro-democracy organizing. The first of these is the idea that we need a revolution to overthrow the capitalist system in order to protect the climate. The second is the idea that we need to focus on one particular leading agent to bring significant change. This topic, as I said before, was adapted from, oh no, I didn't say this. This talk is adapted from part of my book, Consumerism, Sustainability, and Happiness, which includes a review of 3 anti-capitalist books on the climate crisis, which make the claims that I'm arguing against here. I don't want to take the time in this talk to dig into those books, but I'm happy to share a version of the talk that names and discusses the books. I say that by way of warding off a critique that what I'm saying is a straw man and that nobody thinks this way anymore. I will say that regularly in my climate activism, I see the very few committed leftists in my work in climate organizing spaces consistently getting twisted in their thinking around the residues of these two ideas that I'm going to critique. And confusion about these issues blunts the voices of anti-capitalists in organizing spaces. It's my goal to unleash the full power of anti-capitalist thinking by challenging these, what I think of as just unhelpful remnants in anti-capitalist ideology. Okay, so the first is the idea that the capitalist system must be replaced in a single rapid move with an alternative system called socialism. The idea of a system implied in traditional Marxist analyses supposes that capitalism defines the totality of a given society, and it asks us to get rid of that totality in kind of in a sort of a quick and unified way. It also often argues that moves to improve life or solve problems within the capitalist system only serve to reinforce that system. There are a few people, the so-called accelerationists, who, by the way, I'm seeing more of lately, who argue for making things worse in order to hope to crash the present social order and open a pathway toward a socialist revolution. A more broadly held anti-capitalist view is that moves to improve things under capitalism are simply kind of pointless. Maybe they make somebody's life a little bit better, but they don't really, they're not particularly politically significant. And that broader view often argues that the capitalist system will always win until it is overthrown by a revolution. Anti-capitalists often see their role as helping people to see the ways that we will never be able to solve our problems within the capitalist system, and so we must take down capitalism in order to address the climate crisis. This often leads to anti-capitalists in the room being the ones to deflate people's hopes. Let's see, do I have the right page? Hopes and beliefs that the changes that they're making, that the challenges that they're making to the current order have deep significance. When we think of capitalism this way, it becomes hard to imagine the steps we need to take in the present to build a better world. What should we do while we're waiting for a revolution? Should we try to make things better and build a new world? Should we try to make things worse so that they'll crash? There's an alternative anti-capitalist tradition based in the work of J.K. Gibson Graham, that also some of it is done by Richard Wolff and Steve Resnick, that defines capitalist as those economic processes that are based on private property and the private appropriation of value from workers and wage labor. That tradition defines socialist economic processes as those run by the state. The tradition argues that there are many economic processes operating in any society at a given time. In addition to capitalist market processes and state-run processes, there are also ways that we meet our needs that have nothing to do with money or government. This third category is where we make things for ourselves and others, where we care for each other, where we trade things and give things freely. This third aspect I've taken to calling provisioning. There's lots of different words people use. On this view, the goal of anti-capitalism is to eliminate to the extent possible the damaging aspects of our societies that perpetuate capitalist processes. It calls on us to get rid of capitalism one step at a time by undermining the things that drive it. This is the argument of my book, Getting Past Capitalism, where I sort of define the different forms of agency that constitute and perpetuate those capitalist processes. On this view, anti-capitalism is a stepwise movement that can be done in the present time with the political potentials we have in the present moment. Anti-capitalists need to understand the ways that capitalist processes and pro-capitalist thinking are devastating to our shared world. But in contrast to the more orthodox tradition, this anti-capitalist view argues that we need to reweave the social fabric from where we are to build on the things that make governments serve social needs, that constrain markets, that challenge the role of unaccountable business in our societies, and which undermine the pro-capitalist thinking that saturates our societies. The second major trope of anti-capitalist thinking that I want to challenge is the idea that we should look for an objectively determined leading group to lead us to the revolution that we just discussed. Many thinkers steeped in the anti-capitalist analysis hold on to the idea in Marxism that the way to challenge the domination of our political and economic systems by pro-capitalist forces is to mobilize the working class to engage in disruptive actions at the point of production. They argue that this is because that's what Marx argued should happen in the 19th century. There's a tendency within Marxist thinking to want to find a leading class in any political movement. So even if you're done with the industrial proletariat, you've got, the electrical workers or whoever it is, like there's some, or in Mao, it's, the peasantry, whoever it is. It's a very common and tired impulse in this form of thinking to want to find one crucial fulcrum point from which to make an anti-capitalist revolution happen. And yet generations of feminists, those organizing in service sectors, many organizers from the global South, have worked within the anti-capitalist tradition to displace this 100-year-old image of the working class as the men who work in industrial labor as the core of those best positioned to challenge capitalism. But since capitalist forms of destruction are generated at many social locations with many forms of agency, there are many different places where those working to stop pro-capitalist forms of agency can fight against them. At this late date, with only a few years left to deeply decarbonize human society, we cannot afford to focus on one narrow strategy. The urgent fight we are in for the survival of our species requires that we engage in all possible effective forms of struggle to get there. Okay, just so by way of conclusion, given the urgency of the climate crisis and the crisis in democracy, we don't have time to wait for a capitalist revolution, and we cannot narrow our analysis of who should be engaged in this struggle in ways that are based on an outdated understanding of how social change works. We need to use all of the tools at our disposal to make the transition to a sustainable world happen as quickly as possible. In order to address the climate crisis, we need to challenge capitalism. We need to fight against the political power of the fossil fuel industry. We need to fight against the ways that government does the bidding of those forces. We need to challenge pro-capitalist ways of understanding the nature of the economy. We need to challenge the forms of inequality that drive consumerism and also destroy our politics. And we need to understand the ways that entrenched capitalist forces are slowing the transition to a sustainable world. While pushing against those forces in as many ways as we can. We should use our anti-capitalist understanding to add clarity, focus, and power to the movements to address the climate crisis and leave past any ideas from our tradition that discourage urgent and serious action. That was it.
Just realized I didn't unmute myself. Fantastic. Thank you so much, especially giving us time to spare for discussion. But we will then move to our second speaker, which I think this should be an interesting discussion afterwards. I am pleased to present to you all out there watching on YouTube, Reed Kurtz. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. I realized I didn't ask. Reed Kurtz is a political scientist whose work centers on the relations between politics and nature in an age of planetary ecological crisis, with a particular attention to the politics of climate change and climate justice. Currently, he is a lecturer in political science department at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana, where he teaches classes in environmental policy, global environmental politics, international relations, and comparative politics. He is also an active member of the American Association of University Professors and the Industrial Workers of the World, and I'm pleased to present him presenting Climate Change, Direct Action, and the Political. Thank you, Dr. Kurtz, if you could.
Great, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk today. Before I get started, I also want to put in a small plug for my own recently published analysis of the recent election. It's entitled U.S. Politics and Planetary Crisis in 2024, and I posted a link in the chat. It literally just got published today in a volume. There were over 100 social scientists here in North America and the UK who published short analyses of the recent election. It has become common knowledge that climate change is a profoundly political problem. This demands critical reflection and underscores the necessity of a coherent conception of the political to understand its relation to the climate crisis, and, as I argue from the standpoint of climate justice, theorize its resolution. In other words, we need a conception of the political adequate to the task of climate justice. In this presentation, I will outline the politicization problematique as it applies to the politics of climate change, with particular attention to self-identified radical and agonistic perspectives which draw upon the post-Marxist political theory of Chantal Mouffe. I will outline the key features of this approach, which I call the radical or agonistic approach to climate politics, and then subject it to ecological Marxist critique. This eco-Marxist critique proceeds in three main steps. First, I'll demonstrate how agonistic perspectives on climate change, by grounding their conception of the political in a Schmittian binary, naturalize the crisis and its origins. Instead, drawing from Marxist political ecology, climate change is necessary to understand as a capitalogenic crisis, generated from the unsustainable organization of the social metabolism by capitalism. In the concluding section, I briefly outline a Marxist ecological conception of the political, which intends to provide an eco-socialist alternative capable of grounding the politics of climate justice through the theory of direct action as interventions in the organization of the social metabolism between humans and the rest of nature. In sum, I will argue that while the radical agonist conception of the political can provide a compelling analytical basis and potential normative core of an adequately democratic eco-socialism, Marxist political ecology provides a stronger ground for the critical political science or philosophy of praxis necessary for any potential resolution of the climate crisis as a necessary means for realizing the ends of climate justice. Recent climate change scholarship has used theories of agonistic democracy to critique climate politics. Early iterations of the politicization problematique by Marxists Slavoj Zizek and Eric Swingedow criticized depoliticizing effects of environmental discourses in the contradictory dynamics of, on the one hand, the mounting urgency from scientists and mainstream environmentalists regarding climate change, and on the other, a refusal to seriously consider fundamental challenges to the status quo of liberal capitalism. A 2016 article by climate scholars Yves Peppermans and Peter Maciel entitled "The Politicization of Climate Change, Problem or Solution" provides a nice overview of the climate politicization problematique. According to them, the contradiction between increasing urgency for a green transition and relentless production of fossil fuels reflects, quote, the divergence between two perspectives in the social sciences regarding the desirability of disagreement about climate change. What they call the dominant consensus-building perspective emphasizes the need for rational, coordinated, and collective action on climate change, while identifying politicization as an impediment, thereby prescribing depoliticizing strategies which, quote, foster social consensus and public engagement. On the other hand, what they somewhat unhelpfully called the critical debate, and which I identify as the radical agonist perspective, criticizes this depoliticization, instead asserting the priority of contention and repoliticization to struggle against climate change. From the standpoint of climate justice, this presents a dilemma insofar as these are two opposed perspectives on the desirability of politicization upon an otherwise common cause to act politically on climate change towards the end of climate justice. For radicals, consensus building by emphasizing rationalist, positivist, and natural scientific approaches at the expense of political contention is a problem insofar as it maintains the existing power structures and structural injustices at the root causes of climate change, while also contributing to a potential return of the repressed in the form of right-wing reaction. Against this, radicals insist upon the political necessity and desirability of agonistic contention and democracy for realizing more sustainable climate politics. Here we should clarify some important distinctions between radicalism, post-foundationalism, and agonism. First, note that radicalism constitutes an analytical position defined by the drive to address the root of a problem or issue, rather than a political position per se. For example, although radicalism is generally associated with left-wing politics, some right-wing perspectives might be considered radical to the extent that they identify distinct sources of the root of the problem. So here we might consider perspectives that advocate authoritarian environmentalism due to the corruption of human nature or the priority of natural law. On a more kind of contemporary note, we might look at people, kind of self-identified radicals like Steve Bannon, who openly want to emulate Lenin towards obviously clearly reactionary objectives. Thus, radicalism should be understood as an analytical position before a political position. The same goes for post-foundationalism, which informs many radical climate scholars. For Peppermans and Maciel, post-foundationalism, quote, implies that climate change is only observable through representations, which are always the provisional, contingent, and changeable result of power relations and struggles. They distinguish this from the foundationalist outlook of the consensus-building perspective, which understands climate change as a physical phenomenon that can be observed, discerned, quantified, and managed with some degree of scientific objectivity, end quote. However, just as not all climate radicals advocate left politics, not all climate radicals are post-foundationalists. Many radical eco-socialists, including, for example, Andreas Malm or Ian Angus, affirm scientific or critical realism to ground their political ontology. Within post-foundationalist political theory, two right-wing thinkers are central, Carl Schmitt and Martin Heidegger. For post-foundationalists, Heidegger's approach represents a radical critique of Western metaphysics via an ontological weakening of ground. Without a stable or enduring foundation upon which the social can develop, any such grounds must be transient, contingent, and contestable. Hence, the political acts as a boundary between the institutional domain of politics and the untethered ontological grounds of the social. According to Oliver Marchart, post-foundationalism must not be confused with an anti-foundationalism or a vulgar postmodernism. Ontological weakening of ground does not lead to the assumption of the total absence of all grounds, but rather to the assumption of the impossibility of a final ground, which implies an increased awareness of, on the one hand, contingency, and on the other, the political as the moment of partial and always, in the last instance, unsuccessful grounding. For climate radicals, in the face of the escalating stakes and conflicts amid the ongoing fossil-fueled business as usual, Schmitt's influence is decisive via the agonistic conception of the political developed by Chantal Mouffe. For agonists, leading approaches conflate the distinction between politics, or quote, the ensemble of practices, discourses, and institutions that seeks to establish a certain order and to organize human coexistence, and the political, that ineradicable dimension of antagonism which can take many forms and can emerge in diverse social relations. For Gert Goeming, following Swinchedau and Mouffe, the political should be conceived as an ontological dimension that determines our very human condition. Agonists see political opposition as ontologically derived from social identity through social difference. Because political identity has no ultimate foundation or final ground, as the us is always predicated upon a them, following Schmitt, this other always necessarily poses a latent or potential threat. Achieving consensus is, for agonists, at best transitory and often fragile. The goal is thus to forge consensus upon a core set of democratic principles enabling difference and disagreement, sublimating antagonism between potential enemies into socially acceptable forms of agonism between adversaries. Thus, any grounds to society are necessarily politically determined and contingent. Radical democratic agonism, according to this perspective, thus represents the necessary means by which social and political order can be achieved and maintained, however transient or uncertain. Radical agonists are right to insist that the political nature of climate change goes beyond what mere cooperation and consensus can resolve under current conditions. That climate change is above all a political crisis is necessary to affirm. Yet we must still question whether this conception of the political is adequate to the task of confronting, yet alone providing a potential resolution to the climate crisis. For climate scholars Keynes and Levins, uniting post-foundationalists is agreement that, quote, the political is of a symbolic nature and entails a discourse that recognizes and makes visible the reality of conflict, power, and the contingency of society. Environmental problems only exist as political problems to the extent that there are representations of them in the public sphere. Following Marchant, from the absence of ground, no necessary political consequence follows. Thus, the political dwells on society's non-ground as an indeterminate and open process. Accordingly, for radical agonists, the problem is not climate change per se, but rather the means of representation and modes of action enabled or disabled by post-politics. Their task is to repoliticize climate change by resisting the purported consensus, forcing open the range of political alternatives through inclusive agonistic confrontation, including via agonistic citizenship or institutions of the environmental state. If agonism represents a dominant tendency amongst post-foundationalist approaches to environmental politics, then a scientific realist eco-socialism may be its other. While the opening of politics qua the political beyond the presumed limits of the status quo is necessary, politicization alone cannot resolve the climate crisis. That is, certain material ecological conditions of the climate crisis, namely its basis in the contradictions of fossilized capitalism, necessitate certain forms of political praxis as well as foreclose other possibilities, namely those predicated upon the endless expansion of capital accumulation. Recognition of certain intransitive dimensions of our material world, such as the ecological basis and conditions of possibility for our existence as social and political beings, is a defining characteristic of scientific or critical realism. Because political relations are ultimately an emergent property of material relations within nature, including conditions of historical capitalism, there are necessary limits on the forms of political action and organization possible and desirable for achieving determinate political objectives. Clarifying the scope and dimensions of these limits and conditions is necessarily political and ecological because it concerns mediating the metabolic relations between humans and the rest of nature, i.e. the conditions of possibility for politics and society in the first place. This is a historically contingent, open process within what Marx calls a process of natural history. The task is thus eminently political insofar as it consists in the realization of that necessarily contingent ground. Yet even this contingency has certain material and social ecological conditions. Consider climate justice. Not simply an empty signifier, climate justice must be made to more than represent but become the resolution or undoing of the climate crisis, a negative dialectic of the capitalogenic crisis. To quote a slogan from the movement, capitalism is incompatible with climate justice. Each degree of warming eliminates certain just climate futures by how it threatens certain forms of life, including coastal communities, small island nation states, and indigenous societies, plus mass extinctions of non-human species. Realizing climate justice thus necessitates reorganizing our relations within nature. That the specific organization of these relations necessary to achieve or realize climate justice are yet still open, they are historically and politically contingent, does not deny nor reduce their material or ecological basis, nor does it reduce the domain of the social or political to that of the merely discursive or symbolic. Thus, we must affirm the political nature of our planetary ecologies amid this capitalogenic crisis, but this is more than what the agonistic conception alone can offer. Rather, we must affirm certain ecological dimensions of the crisis and necessary means of resolving it via praxis. From a Marxist perspective, this means returning to the point of departure for agonistic post-foundationalism, Gramscian hegemony. For agonists, Schmitt's conception of the political can be used for democratic ends through the post-Marxist conception of hegemony. Political and social orders, according to Laclau and Muff, are fundamentally symbolic and discursive, and hegemony consists, according to them, in the securing and organizing of the underlying symbolic discourse. This rejects any natural or material foundations of social and political relations. Instead, hegemonic struggles in radical democracy are ultimately to define the signifiers around which competing political projects can organize. The climate crisis exemplifies the material and ecological relations of politics and the political. While social and political forces are emergent from nature, these relations are dialectical. To affirm the ecological nature of our politics and the political nature of our ecologies amid the planetary crisis and struggles for climate justice is to acknowledge the extent to which the primary factors transforming the Earth are not merely anthropogenic, but capitalogenic. No analysis of climate change is complete without critique of the roles class, commodity production, and capital have played in the production of climate injustices. Reducing the sources of political antagonism and contradiction to ontological conditions of identity and difference risks naturalizing or essentializing historical and ecological conditions of political organization and conflict. That is, radical agonists risk the same error as uncritical Anthropocene scholars, naturalizing particular and contingent sets of socio-ecological relations under historically specific conditions of capitalism and imperialism. The climate crisis is driven by capital's inherent drive for endless accumulation on a finite planet. Hence, it is not sufficient to rearrange the discursive order of human society to resolve it. Instead, the scope of radical transformation must be far more elemental, to reorganize the metabolism between humans and the rest of nature. Thus, politics and hegemony in an age of climate crisis need grounding in ecological and not merely social relations. Hegemony, as articulated in the Marxist tradition by Gramsci, provides a dialectical approach that overcomes the political binary endemic in radical agonism. According to Peter Thomas, Gramsci's conception of hegemony is the means to provide an analysis of the production or constitution of the political. Hegemony describes the process of this constitution or the way in which the historically identifiable political practices have come to define the nature of politics as such. This forms the foundation for an attempt to think the possibility of a political of a completely different type, a notion and practice of the political that would be adequate to the formation of what Gramsci calls a self-regulated society. Hegemony refers to the leadership of a particular social group and the ways in which their corresponding conception of the world comes to organize and define the world as such, through a dialectic of coercion and consent. In capitalism, the effectiveness of the power exercised by the hegemonic capitalist class lies in the consensual means through which the labor can be coerced. That labor is alienated from the means of production means labor is both free to engage in economic exchange with capital, while simultaneously compelled by the vicissitudes and deprivation that capitalist freedom affords. Meanwhile, overt coercion is reserved for when spontaneous consent fails. Relations between consent and coercion, or consensus building and resistance, are thus not binarily opposed as much as moments in a dialectic. Ideological hegemony and political domination are, quote, not qualitatively distinct from one another, but strategically differentiated forms of a unitary political power, end quote. Thus, a Gramscian approach to the politicization problematique recasts climate justice. The task is not simply to implement more just climate policies or to continually resist and press for more open climate politics, though conditions may continue to render these necessary, nor can it be reduced to symbolic and discursive struggles to fill the empty hegemonic signifiers. Rather, the task is to struggle for an alternative hegemony to overcome capitalist organization of the socio-ecological metabolism and reorganize such relations more justly, equitably, and sustainably. The goal must be a political of a completely different type, adequate to the formation of a self-regulated society, through which climate justice can be realizable. Realizing climate justice as system change, not climate change, requires abolishing unsustainable ecological and social relations of capitalism, not just a proliferation of political alternatives. Hence, the necessary convergence of climate justice movements with eco-socialism and the broader movement and organization for the emancipation of working classes everywhere. So to conclude, Gramscian hegemony provides a valuable perspective for critically analyzing political dimensions of climate justice by focusing on the struggle for leadership over the organization of the social metabolism between humans and nature. This underscores how the climate crisis is not merely a scientific or technical challenge, but fundamentally a political matter that requires more than merely symbolic, but material and ecological actions. Conceptualizing the political in the terms of the struggle for hegemony over the eco-social metabolism further clarifies the role of direct action as a means toward realizing climate justice. And as I've argued elsewhere, more specifically in a 2020 Radical Philosophy Review article on direct action and climate change on a special issue of climate change and radical philosophy that I co-edited, direct action can be understood as the attempts to intervene directly in the organization of this metabolic process, under which capitalism is organized primarily through indirect forms of alienation, exploitation, and domination by capitalist value and the institutions and apparatuses of the integral state. Organizing workplaces and engaging in mass labor actions is necessary to challenge the existing hegemony that subordinates social reproduction to the law of value. Strikes in the energy, transportation, manufacturing sectors not only disrupt business as usual, but can win better material conditions and legal concessions that can further enable organization and development. By the same token, climate strikes by students and other participants in the broader web of social reproduction also disrupt and press the need to address the roots of the crisis that are driven by relations that alienate, exploit, and dominate labor and nature. However, direct action is not merely a means of disrupting capitalist relations. Within it contains the seeds of the democratic self-management of the socio-ecological metabolism necessary for a truly sustainable world system, one freed from the contradictions and antagonisms of capitalism, imperialism, and other alienated, exploitative, and domineering forms of organizing relations within nature. Realizing climate justice requires massive acceleration to build organization and scale up action. This involves expanding mass coordination of working peoples and developing robust strategic frameworks and plans for collective action. A Gramscian eco-socialist conception of the political conceptualized as the struggle for hegemony over the organization of the social metabolism, or alternatively, the mediation of the dialectic between the natural and the social, provides a better means both for critically analyzing the political dynamics of the crisis, as well as providing means for resolving it at all sites of social reproduction. That is the end.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I hope people in the chat, if you're there, I don't know if there's any questions, Chris. I don't know if you see any there.
There is one from Sarah Vitale for Cynthia. I think I can paraphrase it. It's she wants to know which were, I believe it was the 3 different books that you criticize in your own book. So the those who
Okay.
are straw men, but are, actual positions. Yeah.
Yeah. So Half Earth Socialism by Vitesse and Pendergrass, they sort of make that argument about, we need to crack the system to get to have a revolution, basically. And then Matthew Huber's Climate Change is Class War. And I think I'm going to leave the third one aside because my critique of it is softer and more complex. So I'm just going to say those two. So Matthew Huber's Climate Change is Class War, where he really looks for the leading class and argues that it's people who work in the electrical sector who should shut it down, which, like, that'd be nice, but there's also a bunch of other stuff that has to happen, and good luck getting electrical workers to be the vanguard. Like, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, did you have any questions, Chris? If not, I can go. Let me know.
I do, but I'd like you to go first. Go ahead, Jake.
Oh, okay. So my thought is, I thought at first when I saw the titles, perhaps there might be a conflict. I actually don't think you're as conflicted as not. In fact, my thought in all of this is, so permit me to sort of give my analysis. Cynthia, my thought was, it's like you're retelling the reform versus revolution debate, and you're saying we've forgotten about realism and realism in constructing socialist states, period, right? And thus we need to think, because we have this anti-statist, the state will dissolve, and we want to get there now. We forget the work of building Cuba, other countries, and this made me think, and this is how I'm going to bridge to both of you, is AMLO had me thinking, because we have some tricky stuff there. I don't know how familiar both of you are with that.
Yeah.
And Reed, I think I saw the same sort of thing in looking for a different alternative hegemony with different politics. I was reminded of in a sense, what Adorno says, right? If everyone's responsible for this, then no one is, and that is the sort of naturalization of climate change, right? We have all done this together, when that is just not true. There are sectors that have done it, and as such, the politics needs to reflect that. And if we're talking about the motor of the controls, the metabolism, that's the state, right? And that's why I think of AMLO as well in his contradictions, because on the one hand we see trying to get off of oil, but on the other hand the Mayan train, right? I don't know if you're well familiar with that conflict. And so if you could start, Cynthia, and then Reed after that, I would enjoy hearing your thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, and I don't know how you felt, Reed, but I thought, like, yeah, I agree with everything you said, and I think fundamentally you and I are both traditional Gramscians, which is just so good. Gramsci's the best, like the real Gramsci, not the kind of watered down, dematerialized Gramsci. So I really thoroughly agree with you, and yeah, in the critique of Laclau and Mouffe on that. Yeah, and I would say that I characterize my position as radical reform, right? And I do feel like that sort of reform, and that's another trope that kind of constantly reaffirms its head. That whenever you're doing serious organizing to make things better, it's like that's reformist. It's like, I mean, and sometimes it feels almost bad to even be talking about it because it's so intellectually ludicrous, and yet people are still publishing books on this stuff. So, in other words, sort of acting as if there were a binary between revolution and reform, as opposed to, the language I would use is sort of radical reform to deeply change the underlying structure of society.
How about you, Reed, if you could?
Yeah, just to kind of build off of what Cynthia, you were saying, I mean, so for me, I think there's kind of two things maybe worth kind of emphasizing or expanding on. And one is, I think it's kind of like the necessity of rereading Gramsci in light of all of the developments we have seen over the past several decades in the kind of flourishing of ecological Marxist thought, and the kind of the realization that Marx, particularly in his later kind of like the last third, or kind of the latter part of his career, was again profoundly influenced by the emerging field of natural history and the ecological sciences. And so I think there's a tendency to read Gramsci in a context that's just limited by the kind of debates and the kind of historical context in which he was writing, in which, there are readings of Gramsci as, more of what I would call a social, having more of a social conception of the political. Part of my project and my task is to get us to think about, again, not just Gramsci, but to think about how the social and the political are themselves emergent from nature and are thus at their core ultimately ecological at their basis. And again, I think the kind of broadly critical Marxist framework offers the kind of the best way of doing that. And again, Gramsci and kind of, again, this follows through with Poulan Sauce and the field of Marxist political ecology that's also deeply influenced by Gramsci. Again, there's a lot of rich tools there. I also, I can imagine Jake and others, kind of in kind of the initial framing with the influence on the role of direct action and labor in my framework. I think there might be I can understand the what would it be, the kind of spontaneous reaction to kind of associate with maybe more orthodox or narrowly defined Marxisms that I think, Cynthia, you're a little bit more critical of. But again, when I talk about direct action and when I think about the organization of the social metabolism, I'm deeply influenced by again ecofeminism and social reproduction theory, and thinking about again all of the different sites and processes that are ultimately involved in the production and reproduction of capitalist society. And so direct action, again, doesn't necessarily have to take place in the traditional forms of, the worker who refuses to, take their shift at the mill or, to go into strike. But again, I think it enables us to see how, again, intervening at the sites of, again, where ideological reproduction in terms of, the Greta Thunbergs and others, the climate strike movement, again, located at the schools, thinking about the role that public health workers and others, I mean, again, as a field, public health is one of the ones that you can look at, the mainstream journals, you can look at, again, the major associations. These are issues that they are deeply concerned with. And again, these are integral parts of the process of social reproduction. And so, again, just to kind of, show my, how would I say, like compatibility or affinity with the framework that Cynthia is arguing. I mean, one of the things I tell my students is, I mean, again, the nature of the crisis, it impacts all facets of our life. It is totalizing. We are all implicated, which means that it takes all forms. It takes a variety and a multiplicity of forms of, again, resistance, but also counter-organization. Like, it's not enough to just simply resist, but we have to be actively, building and, again, reproducing the type of politics that we want to embrace. Now, again, part of the task of the critical intellectual and the task of philosophy of praxis, you might say, is again to identify what are the, maybe the more strategically crucial axes, which sites of social reproduction should we be maybe focusing our energies. Again, I think that's a different question than simply saying, okay, it's only this class who's capable of creating this change. Rather, it's as a movement who has to strategically think about how we're going to use our resources and our capabilities. It's more a matter of how do we direct our attention or how do we focus our energies rather than disregarding or ignoring, because it truly requires again, basically all forms by as many people as we can, right? And so it kind of as expansive a conception, I would argue, of what the processes and sites of social reproduction entail, without, again, kind of falling into this, we're all in it together, we're all responsible. We all have a part to play, perhaps, but again, it's gonna take very kind of specific types of interventions to resist and reorganize these relations.
I know there's a bunch of other questions, but I just wanted to say really briefly, I agree with that. In other words, having sort of tried to get rid of the like dumb ways that Marxist thinks about these, we need to now we need to do the work of analyzing like where the leverage points are. And I do have a piece in the an upcoming radical philosophy review on how to take down the fossil fuel industry. In other words, sort of analyzing the different kind of pillars that support the political power of that industry. So I really agree with you that that's where we should be putting a lot of our intellectual attention.
Very good. No, I'd like to hear that. Yes, I think strategy and tactics. We've forgotten a little bit. Chris, I believe if you'd be willing to read some of the questions from YouTube.
Yeah, we've got two, and they're, I think, distinct but related. So I'll read them both, but speakers handle them as you will, and maybe that just means tackling the first one and then going to the second. But Larry Busk asks, could one or both of you comment on degrowth and its relationship to anti-capitalist politics? And then Brandon Abster's question, which sort of follows on that, says, how do we conceive the political space we're in under the temporal limitations that we face? As you both may know, Larry above has argued that it necessitates a kind of climate Jacobinism. So those are the two questions.
I went first last time. Reed, do you want to go first this time? I mean, or I can just jump in on the degrowth one right away.
Yeah, so if you want to go ahead, that'd be fine.
Okay, so yeah, I have a lot that I've written about critiques of the ideology of growth that we all know is like ridiculous and terrible and all of that, but I personally don't like the concept of degrowth because I feel like growth is a metric. It's like it was a tool that was invented to look at boom and bust cycles in the economy. It was never meant as a measure of a good economy. So just because we're against its use in that form as like it means a good economy, to me the idea of degrowth is like we're taking that thing and flipping it on its side, and I just think it's an irrelevant measure is what I would say. It's not a helpful measure of how are we meeting our social needs. So that's my feeling, and so I don't think it's a helpful concept, actually. I really don't. I think the critique of growth is enormously helpful, but those are two different questions. Yeah, I'll get back to you on the Jacobism question. I'm not quite sure. Yeah.
For what it's worth, I'm actually kind of glad you said that, Cynthia, just because it maybe makes it a little bit easier for me. So, I mean, I guess I take a little bit maybe more of a, I don't know, I wouldn't say how would I say, agnostic, or I tend to be a little bit maybe more I would say inclusive of degrowth perspectives than perhaps some more strongly, eco-Marxist perspectives, insofar as, I guess for me, it's a matter of, kind of building upon existing frameworks as they exist. So one of the things I do appreciate about degrowth perspectives is that, again, these are both emergent from not just academic, but also movements themselves. So again, degrowth and décroissance, again, has kind of strong ties with, these kind of movements that we see largely, again, in the kind of European continent and elsewhere. So I would argue, and I will also say too, I teach here at Purdue, where there's a lot of engineers and there's a lot of, people who are just, again, scientists and other kind of, let's just say they're kind of maybe more traditionally technocratically inclined people who nevertheless find the kind of degrowth program as very appealing, or it's kind of like a pathway in, because again, if you are a systems engineer or you're an industrial engineer, and again, a lot of this research comes out of ecological economics and the basic, you know, kind of thermodynamics and these kinds of like, macro processes, right? And so for me, degrowth is as much a way of kind of pulling people in, I guess, when it comes to thinking about, degrowth versus a kind of a more stringently, let's call it just Marxist eco-socialism. Again, I've seen some of the debates and critiques in Capital and Nature Socialism around like actually what we do need, we still actually do need to grow in terms of our technological capabilities, in terms of renewables, and therefore eco-socialism and growth, at least in the short run, is not incompatible. Again, I'm a little bit more, I think we need as inclusive of a movement at this stage as possible once we are able to maybe better clarify or again have more impact in terms of actually slowing or putting the brakes on business as usual. Then there might be then those kind of dividing lines between, let's call it just degrowth and eco-socialism, may become a lot more salient. But again, I think right now it's as much a matter of we need basically as many hands on deck as possible. And again, I don't know, there's also a critique that says, well, degrowth is in and of itself off-putting to people. And so I don't, that being said, I don't know if I don't know. I don't really like just relying upon slogans as much as we need kind of like concrete proposals, and we need, kind of more clear paths to action. And so by that extent, it does seem clear to me we need to kind of, I'm more in the degrowth versus, accelerationism camp, if as you kind of referenced.
Yeah, me too.
Earlier, but again, for me, it's kind of like, these are starting to parse the, I don't know. I guess I'm a little bit more willing to say that, degrowth should be part of the movement, but that doesn't mean that it's the solution, right?
Yeah. And now I wanted to jump on the, I mean, the temporal issue is freaking serious, right? Like it's really, really serious, but I don't know what a call to Jacobinism means in this context. I mean, I'm sort of a by any means necessary person as a political strategist, and I'm really a political strategist. That's a lot of what my actual work is that I do. And it's like, again, it's just like, we wish we could just like snap our fingers and call for a revolution, but it's not going to happen. And no matter how kind of like excited we get or intense we get, or we say like, like, sure, monkey wrenching, absolutely. Civil disobedience, absolutely. Like, all of the above. And then being smart, like we were saying earlier about like, which things do we think we need to put more into? But yeah, I don't know. So I'm curious about where that question comes from, is if there's a piece of the all of the above that none of us have thought about that would accelerate things. I don't know what that would be. I'm trying to make it move as fast as I can with what I do, but so is everybody else.
So I think this is so, and again, I'm not speaking for Brandon or for Larry here, but for me, I wonder if this is where somebody like Andreas Malm and his call for, basically the escalation of, tactics by the climate movement in the form of ecological sabotage. I wonder if that speaks here. Now, again, I think that Malm, the interventions that he's making are some of the most important and contributions to our understanding of the climate crisis and the political dimensions of it, and the tactics and the strategy. It's not just his most recent book, it's not the most recent anymore. I mean, he publishes an incredible clip, but the How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Before that, the book on Corona and the climate crisis as well provides a kind of an interesting idea of what you know, a kind of he calls it like a ecological war communism and what that might look like. And what's interesting to me is between the kind of like the vision of this kind of interventionist, eco-Leninist kind of state, and then you've got the you know, the kind of insurrectionary, you know, ecological sabotage. What I find in between these kind of two poles is again the necessity for a conception of hegemony and hegemony and the struggle for hegemony as kind of the path between how do we get from direct action as sabotage to a hegemony in which labor can directly mediate its own organization of the metabolic processes between humans and nature. And so what we need is we need to continue to think about you know, not just direct action in this form of striking at capital, but that as kind of one piece in this broader puzzle, I guess. And so again, thinking about the role and the place of again, I don't know if this is, I don't know, again, I'm sorry, I'm not super familiar with the kind of climate Jacobinism nature of it, but I understand it to more or less kind of mean that there's going to be, you know, this kind of maybe vanguard who are going to lead these, you know, kind of high stakes interventions. But at the same time, it's, you know, there also at the same time has to be a broader mass of, you know, again, the kind of the war of position, we might say, in kind of Gramscian terms. So Malm, again, I think rightfully wants to emphasize the climate movement has for too long conceded the war of movement to take the kind of more physical direct strikes and the direct action. One of the more alarming things to me, though, is the fact that it seems that we, in focusing on maybe the war of movement at the expense of the war, or excuse me, focusing on the war of position through the kind of apparatuses of producing consent, we have in some ways conceded the ground on the war of movement. And again, here in the United States, we are already seeing, I think, the problem with that. So now the question becomes, okay, well, again, how do we even maintain survival here under these conditions, under this incoming administration? I mean, these are things we need to take very seriously, but again, I think it takes all forms, and it's going to take a broad-based movement, and it's going to take, again, organizing with immigrants. It's going to take organizing with regards to, again, reproductive rights. Again, what is more crucial to securing the social metabolism than control over the ability to reproduce, control over how we produce our food and consume that? Again, if we think about where the threats are coming right now, it is on those fronts. And so those are entirely compatible with, again, eco-socialist hegemonic struggle. But again, it's going to take all forms, and we have to take action now.
Okay, I just want to say, beautiful use of Gramsci again, right? That Gramsci always takes us back to where you need to go in terms of strategy, which is that you need both of those, you need both sides of that equation, war of maneuver and war of position. Because sometimes when people are sort of saying, you know, it's so urgent that we need to, you know, whatever, like sort of, you know, engage in you know, eco-terrorism and that sort of thing, you know, it's just like, yeah. And then you've got to think about what that does in terms of support for the movement. So you always have to think about the thing kind of holistically in terms of those different pieces.
Perfect. That is a fantastic little way to end here. I think we're a little over, but I think this was a fine discussion. I'd like to thank both our presenters, Dr. Kaufman, Dr. Kurtz. I'd like to thank you, Chris, as well. So this ends our fall restarting of the Radical Philosophy Hour. Keep tuned. We're gonna hopefully have our spring schedule set up very, very soon. And thank you all for watching. Hopefully we will